Hi, I'm on section 14.2 of the nervous system, and we're going to talk about the central nervous system. And I am not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but at least getting the basics and getting familiar with some of the terminology will help you if you take a more advanced class and get into more detail about these different things. So the first thing to remind yourself is the central nervous system, or the CNS, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And so we get a lot of information is integrated in the brain and the spinal cord. It's initiated in the brain and the spinal cord, and it also receives information from the sensory part of the nervous system. So here it says both the brain and the spinal cord are wrapped in protective membranes called meninges. And a lot of people are familiar with that because we talk about meningitis, and probably most of you are vaccinated against various types of meningitis. Because if you get an infection around your brain and spinal cord, it can be very debilitating. And some of these infections can kill you within a day. So it's really important to protect yourself from meningitis. The membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord, the meninges, so there's a layer of membranes around the brain and spinal cord, and between the meninges and the brain or the spinal cord is some fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. And just like the blood can deliver nutrients and take away wastes, the cerebrospinal fluid can do the same thing. And it actually is being made in the brain. It circulates inside of the brain and then around the brain and the spinal cord, and then it's reabsorbed back into the brain and back into the cardiovascular system. So instead of the brain having blood all around it, where you might have toxic compounds or undesirable things touching the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid is kind of a cleaned up version of the blood and can protect and cushion the central nervous system. Let's see. These terms really confuse people, but they're pretty important, and if you think about them, they can make sense. Gray matter and white matter. Both the brain and the spinal cord, if you have fresh tissue, which I've never actually seen a fresh brain, but apparently there's parts that look kind of grayish and parts that look kind of whitish. And it says the white matter are myelinated axons. Remember, we said when we're looking at neurons, the myelinated axons, the myelin sheath is like a lipid layer, so that's what makes it white. And remember, the axons are just carrying impulses one direction down the axon. And so that's what white matter is. White matter is kind of like the highways in the nervous system where impulses are being sent out or carried into the brain and the spinal cord. The gray matter, it consists mostly of cell bodies or short axons that are not myelinated. They don't have a myelin sheath, and they don't need it because they're small. And mostly these are those interneurons that are connecting other neurons. So it's really in the gray matter where we get all the connections between neurons. And that's where the really serious integration, the really complex things that our brain and spinal cord do, is happening in the gray matter. Whereas the white matter are really just the highways to get impulses to get things to and from the brain and the spinal cord. So here they talk about the spinal cord. It starts at the base of the brain. There's an opening in the skull called the foramen magnum. It's a big hole, and the spinal cord goes through there and down the vertebral canal. And it shows you right here that there's this kind of gray butterfly in the middle of all this white matter. So this is a transverse or cross section and of a spinal cord. And that spinal cord is about as big as my pinky. It's about as thick as my pinky. So when somebody damages their spinal cord or cuts it, it has to get through about that big of an area. Okay. Now, if you've ever had problems with your back, or people that have had problems with your back, it's not surprising when you look at the anatomy of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So here's a vertebra that, the bones that make up the vertebral column of the back. And what you can see is in the middle is that spinal cord, that little piece about as thick as your pinky. And coming out in between are the spinal nerves. And here they show you kind of another view without the bones on it. And here's a longitudinal section that was cut right through the bones. And notice that the spinal nerves, they go right between the spaces of these bones. So you can imagine if there's any tissue that gets inflammation, you get any kind of damage or inflammation, these spinal nerves can get pinched between these bones of the vertebrae. And a lot of people have various issues related to back pain because of the pinching of the vertebrae and the spinal nerves between the vertebrae. Now you've got this kind of double-edged sword. You need the vertebrae to prevent the spinal cord from getting damaged, but you also run the risk of pinching nerves by having all these bony structures there. So it's just the way it is. So here's the nerves coming off the spinal cord. And functions of the spinal cord provides communication between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. Remember, the peripheral nervous system are the nerves. So the spinal cord provides communication between the brain and the nerves, the rest of the nerves in the body, and carries the, it's like the superhighway, and then the nerves are kind of the smaller highways. And there's groups of nerves that are that carry impulses up in the spinal cord, and there's groups that carry impulses down. Here they talk about if the spinal cord is severed, like I mentioned, you can't carry impulses up or down, and if it affects only the legs, then you have paraplegia, and all four limbs, it's called quadriplegia. Yeah, let's see. Thought I was going to say something else. Oh yeah, so when you think about it, the spinal cord is really kind of a superhighway, but you can only actually initiate movement from the brain. So if you don't have a connection between the brain and a limb, that limb is not going to be able to move. If you don't have a connection between that limb and the brain, that limb, even though sensory receptors can be stimulated, you can touch, and the touch receptors can be stimulated, that information isn't interpreted as touch until it reaches the brain. So it's the spinal cord and the brain have to work together. The brain has four major parts: the cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, and brainstem. And the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. And it shows you a picture here where there's actually, this is from a top view. So this is what we would call a sagittal section. You divide the left and the right. And here's a top view of the brain. So you can see there's actually a space. There's actually two sides or two hemispheres to the cerebrum. And so the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. Then we have the diencephalon, which is kind of this middle part of the brain. The brain stem actually connects the diencephalon down to the spinal cord. So here's that hole in the skull, that foramen magnum, and the spinal cord goes through there. And then the last part of the brain is the cerebellum. So let's talk about the cerebrum. And really, the cerebrum is really what makes us unique from other organisms. The cerebrum is where we really do our higher level processing, memory, a lot of integration, planning, all of that, personality, all that kind of stuff goes on in the cerebrum. The two sides of the cerebrum are actually attached through some tissue called the corpus callosum. That's right here. And every once in a while you hear about somebody who has like terrible seizures or something, and they end up disconnecting the corpus callosum, and it causes a lot of learning disabilities of the two sides of your brain not being able to communicate. This term, cerebral cortex, is the very outer layer of the cerebrum. Let's see if it tells you how. It's only a couple millimeters thick. It's pretty small layer, but it says it contains over 1 billion cell bodies. And so what happens is this very outside, like if you were to touch the cerebrum, the very outside surface is what we would call would be gray matter, and that's the cerebral cortex, where all these cell bodies are integrating with each other. And so that's where the highest function in the brain, most complex functions, is going on. Deeper in the brain is white matter, and these are just axons that are carrying information to and from the cerebral cortex. Let's see. The diencephalon is, like I said, is the kind of middle part of the brain, and it also, you might have heard of the hypothalamus. It's in there. Yeah, the main thing with the diencephalon, it says it regulates hunger, sleep, thirst, body temperature. It controls the pituitary gland, and if you did endocrine, you would learn that the pituitary gland is what we call the master gland. It controls a lot of other endocrine functions in the body. The cerebellum, remember that's the kind of the second largest part of the brain. This part right here, cerebellum actually means little cerebrum. And it's kind of interesting. It is the part of the brain that coordinates body movements. And so it takes care of something called proprioception. Like right now, I'm sitting here, my hands are in my lap, and I know my hands are in my lap because I have receptors in my muscles that send signals to my brain to tell me where my hands are. And there's receptors that tell me where my feet are. And so I can, without looking at them, I know where my body parts are. So I can actually close my eye and touch my ear, and that's because of my cerebellum. My cerebellum makes up kind of a map in your brain as to where your body is in space. And cerebellum is really important to all of us. Think about somebody who's drinking alcohol and they become very, uncoordinated. Turns out alcohol has a big effect on the cerebellum. So the lack of coordination that somebody has when they're drunk is due to failure of the cerebellum. The other one is if you're an athlete, the complex movements that are necessary to kick a ball or to throw a ball or to, swim, whatever, swing a racket, all those kind of things. All that coordination is coordinated through the cerebellum. So one of the reasons why we get when you do the sobriety test and they tell you touch your nose or walk in a straight line, it's testing your cerebellum. I read an article once, I thought it was kind of interesting. It said, if a person practices throwing balls in a basket, practices basketball, they actually create changes in their cerebellum and they get better at it. So you connect neurons to allow you to coordinate your body better by physically practicing. But they also saw some improvement in people that just watched other people throw baskets. And by watching other people, you still get changes in your brain, and you actually can become slightly better. Now, not as good as if you practiced, but you can have impact on your brain just by watching people do activities. Okay, and the last part of the brain I have here is the brain stem. And we always think of the brain stem as the most primitive part of the brain. You can see it has three parts, midbrain pons and medulla, or medulla oblongata. And altogether, it does the kinds of things that every organism's brain needs to do. There's reflex centers for visual, auditory, and tactile responses. One of those is like if you hear a sound, you're instantly going to turn your head towards that sound. And there's a lot of coordination going on there because you hear the sound, you know which direction it's coming from. So it tells you turn your head towards that sound and track your eyes towards that sound. You don't do this like turn your head and then track your eyes. It's a reflex for you to track your eyes with your head. And all of that's coordinated in the brainstem. Here it says there's reflex centers for head movements. The medulla oblongata also takes care, and part of the brainstem takes care of the heartbeat, for regulating heartbeat, breathing, and blood pressure. So again, here it says also contains reflex centers for vomiting, coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, swallowing. These are kind of interesting because Sometimes you'll hear about somebody who is considered brain dead or has such a severe brain trauma that their cerebrum isn't really working, and they appear to be, non-functional, but they might cough, or they might sneeze, or they might move their eyes. And those are reflexes. It doesn't mean that person has awareness. The awareness that you're doing that, or the decision to do that, has to happen in the cerebrum. So you can have some of these reflexes without having any awareness of them. And I think that's where I'm going to end. There's some good questions right here, at least number 1 and number 2.